The early morning fog clung to the mountains like a shroud, rolling across the still waters of Castaic Lake in the pre-dawn darkness of August 30th, 2013. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of Interstate 5 traffic, a familiar sound that had become the soundtrack to countless commuters making their way through the Sierra Pelona Mountains northwest of Los Angeles. But in those quiet hours, something was terribly wrong. Somewhere in the shadows of this recreational paradise, a young man had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt his family for years to come. If you've ever wondered about the mysteries that unfold right in our own backyard, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your stories and insights help us uncover the truth together. Bryce David Laspisa had everything going for him. At 19 years old, the red-haired college sophomore with piercing blue eyes stood tall at 5 feet 11 inches, carrying himself with the confident stride of someone who seemed to have found his place in the world. The tattoo of a Taurus bullhead with Roman numerals on his left shoulder spoke to his pride in his identity, while his warm smile and easy laugh made him instantly likable to those who met him. He was the kind of young man who drew people in, the type who made friends easily and kept them close. Living in Rocklin, California, just outside Sacramento, Bryce was beginning his sophomore year at Sierra College, pursuing his education with the support of loving parents who had watched him grow from a curious child into a thoughtful young adult. His parents, Michael and Karen Laspisa, lived about 400 miles south in the picturesque community of Laguna Niguel in Orange County, where they had built a comfortable life and eagerly awaited their son's visits home during breaks from school. The relationship between Bryce and his parents had always been close. Karen, in particular, maintained regular contact with her son, checking in on his studies, his social life, and his general well-being. Michael, steady and supportive, provided the kind of fatherly guidance that had helped shape Bryce into the responsible young man they knew him to be. When Bryce called home, which he did frequently, their conversations were filled with the ordinary details of college life, discussions about classes, friends, and future plans. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly routine, until the last week of August 2013. The first signs that something was amiss began to surface on August 27, 2013, just a few days into what should have been an exciting return to campus for his second year. Bryce's behavior started to shift in ways that concerned those closest to him. His roommate, along with close friends, began noticing changes that seemed out of character. The easygoing young man they knew appeared increasingly agitated, restless in a way that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. What made these behavioral changes particularly alarming was their sudden onset. Bryce had not displayed any significant mental health issues in the past, nor had he shown signs of the kind of deep depression or anxiety that might explain such a dramatic shift in personality. His academic performance had been solid, his social relationships stable, and his family life supportive. Yet here he was, just days into the semester, exhibiting behaviors that left those around him feeling unsettled and concerned. Friends would later describe how Bryce seemed disconnected from conversations, his usually bright eyes appearing distant and unfocused. He would sometimes sit quietly for long periods, staring off into space as if contemplating something far beyond the immediate present. When he did engage, his responses often seemed delayed, as if he were processing information more slowly than usual. These weren't dramatic outbursts or obvious cries for help, but rather subtle shifts that created a sense of unease among those who cared about him. The changes weren't limited to his emotional state. Bryce's daily routines began to suffer as well. He seemed less interested in attending classes regularly, and when he did show up, professors noticed that his participation and engagement had declined noticeably from the previous year. His roommate observed that Bryce was sleeping at odd hours, sometimes staying awake late into the night, and then sleeping well into the afternoon, disrupting the normal rhythms that had characterized his first year of college. Perhaps most concerning was the way Bryce began to talk about his possessions. In what would later be seen as a significant red flag, he started giving away items that held personal value. His Xbox gaming system, which had been a source of entertainment and social connection with friends, was offered to someone almost casually. More troubling still, he gave away a pair of diamond earrings that had sentimental value, treating them as if they were merely burdens he needed to shed rather than meaningful possessions worth keeping. These acts of generosity, while seemingly kind on the surface, carried an undertone that worried those who witnessed them. There was something final about the way Bryce was distributing his belongings, as if he were settling accounts or preparing for something that required him to travel light. When friends asked about his motivations, his explanations were vague and unsatisfying, lacking the clear reasoning they had come to expect from someone who typically thought through his decisions carefully. The weekend before his disappearance brought additional concerns. Bryce's drinking, which had been within normal college limits previously, seemed to intensify. While many college students experiment with alcohol as part of their social experience, Bryce's consumption appeared to be serving a different purpose. Rather than social lubrication or celebratory excess, his drinking seemed designed to numb or escape something that was troubling him deeply. More alarming still were reports that Bryce had begun experimenting with recreational drugs, something that was completely out of character for the responsible young man his family knew. The specific substances and extent of his use remained unclear, but the fact that he was turning to chemical substances at all represented a significant departure from his previous behavior patterns. For someone who had been health-conscious and goal-oriented, this shift towards substance use suggested that he was struggling with something he felt unable to handle through conventional means. As August 28, 2013 approached, Bryce made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events that continues to baffle investigators and devastate his family to this day. He decided to drive home to visit his parents in Laguna Niguel, a journey that should have taken approximately 7 hours under normal circumstances. It was a trip he had made numerous times before, a familiar route down Interstate 5 that connected his college life in Northern California with his family home in the South. The decision to go home wasn't entirely unexpected. Bryce had always been close to his parents, and it wasn't unusual for him to want to visit, especially during the early weeks of a new semester when stress levels might be running higher than normal. Michael and Karen were delighted to hear that their son wanted to come home for a visit. They prepared for his arrival with the kind of anticipation that loving parents feel when expecting a child they haven't seen in a while. But this trip would be different from any Bryce had ever taken. What should have been a straightforward drive along well-traveled highways would instead become a mysterious odyssey filled with inexplicable delays concerning behavior, and ultimately a disappearance that would leave investigators with more questions than answers. On the evening of August 28th, Bryce loaded his belongings into his Toyota Highlander SUV, a reliable vehicle that had served him well during his time at college. He packed a duffel bag with clothes and personal items, ensuring he had everything he needed for what was expected to be a relatively short visit home. His laptop, wallet, and cell phone were secured in the vehicle, along with other personal possessions that would later become crucial pieces of evidence in understanding what happened during those final hours. The drive from Rocklin to Laguna Niguel typically follows a straightforward route south along Interstate 5, passing through the Central Valley, over the Grapevine Mountain Pass, and down into the Los Angeles Basin before continuing south to Orange County. It's a well-maintained highway with plenty of rest stops, gas stations, and restaurants along the way. Under normal circumstances, with breaks for fuel and food, the journey takes between 7 and 8 hours, making it easily manageable in a single day. Bryce departed his apartment sometime after dark, beginning what his parents expected would be a routine trip home. The initial stages of his journey appeared normal, with the SUV making steady progress southward along the familiar route. However, as the hours passed and the night deepened, something began to go wrong. The straightforward trip that should have brought Bryce to his parents' door by mid-morning August 29th instead became an inexplicable marathon of delays and concerning behavior. The first sign that all was not well came in the form of time itself. As the hours ticked by through the night and into the morning of August 29th, Bryce should have been arriving at his destination. Instead, he seemed to be moving with unusual slowness along the route, making far less progress than expected. When his parents tried to reach him by phone to check on his progress, they found that their calls sometimes went unanswered, and when he did respond, his explanations for the delays were vague and unconvincing. Karen Laspisa, like many mothers, had developed a sixth sense about her son's well-being, and something in his voice during their phone conversations began to worry her. While Bryce assured her that everything was fine and that he was simply taking his time, there was a quality to his responses that didn't ring true. He seemed distracted, sometimes taking long pauses before answering questions, as if he were having difficulty focusing on the conversation. As August 29th progressed, the delays became more pronounced and more difficult to explain. Bryce's progress along the route slowed to a crawl, with long periods where his location seemed to remain virtually unchanged. When his parents used technology to track his cell phone, they discovered that he appeared to be staying in the same areas for hours at a time, behavior that made no sense for someone supposedly trying to complete a 7-hour drive home. The town of Buttonwillow in Kern County became a focal point of concern, as Bryce seemed to remain in the vicinity for an extended period. Buttonwillow is a small agricultural community along Interstate 5, the kind of place most travelers pass through quickly on their way to somewhere else. It offers the basic amenities needed by highway travelers: gas stations, fast food restaurants, and truck stops, but it's not typically a destination in itself. For reasons that remain unexplained, Bryce appeared to spend many hours in or around Buttonwillow, far longer than would be necessary for a simple stop to refuel or grab a meal. When his parents called to check on his location, he provided explanations that didn't fully account for the extended delay. He mentioned needing to rest, feeling tired, or taking care of some unspecified business, but none of these reasons seemed adequate to explain why he would remain in one area for so many hours. The situation became concerning enough that Karen and Michael made the decision to involve law enforcement. On August 29th, they filed a missing persons report with the Orange County Sheriff's Department, explaining that their son was overdue for an expected arrival and that his behavior during phone conversations had been worrying them. The police took their concerns seriously, particularly given the unusual nature of the extended delays and the changes in Bryce's behavior that his parents described. Using cell phone tracking technology, authorities were able to determine Bryce's approximate location. What they found was both reassuring and puzzling. Bryce was indeed alive and apparently unharmed, but he was still in the Buttonwillow area, having made minimal progress during many hours on the road. Officers were dispatched to make contact with him and assess his condition. When police officers located Bryce around 9 p.m. on August 29th, they found him sitting in his Toyota Highlander in what appeared to be a state of unusual calm. He was polite and cooperative when approached, showing no signs of obvious distress or impairment that might explain his behavior. When officers asked about his extended stay in the area, his explanations were vague but not alarming enough to suggest immediate danger or mental health crisis. The officers conducted a brief search of Bryce's vehicle with his permission, looking for anything that might explain his unusual behavior or suggest he was in some kind of trouble. They found nothing obviously concerning: no weapons, no large amounts of drugs or alcohol, no signs of coercion or foul play. His personal belongings appeared normal and intact, and he seemed to have adequate money and resources for his journey. Perhaps most importantly, Bryce agreed to call his parents while the officers were present, providing Karen and Michael with some reassurance that their son was safe. During this conversation, Bryce told his parents that he was repacking his car and organizing his belongings, and he assured them that he would resume his journey home promptly. His voice sounded more normal during this call, lacking some of the concerning qualities that had worried his parents during earlier conversations. The police officers, satisfied that Bryce was not in immediate danger and was free to make his own decisions as an adult, allowed him to continue on his way. There was no legal basis to detain him, as he had committed no crime and showed no signs of being a danger to himself or others. From a law enforcement perspective, this appeared to be a case of a young adult taking longer than expected on a road trip, concerning to worried parents, but not necessarily indicative of anything sinister. After the police contact, Bryce did indeed resume his journey southward on Interstate 5, apparently heading toward his parents' home as promised. For a brief time, it seemed as though the crisis had passed, and that whatever had been causing his unusual behavior had resolved itself. His parents waited with anticipation and relief, expecting that their son would arrive home safely within the next few hours. But the relief was short-lived. As the night progressed, Bryce's movement again slowed dramatically. Rather than making steady progress toward Laguna Niguel, he seemed to be stopping frequently or traveling at an unusually slow pace. His parents' attempts to reach him by phone met with mixed success, and when they did connect, his responses were again concerning. Around 12:30 a.m. on August 30th, as the calendar rolled over to what would become the day of his disappearance, Karen tried calling Bryce, but received no answer. The silence was particularly worrying given the events of the previous day and the reassurances he had provided to the police officers. When her phone remained quiet, Karen's maternal instincts told her that something was still very wrong. At 1:50 a.m., Bryce finally returned his mother's call, but the conversation did little to ease her concerns. When Karen asked about his location, hoping to gauge his progress toward home, Bryce told her something that would later prove to be one of the last coherent communications they would ever have. He said it was too dark to read road signs, making it impossible for him to tell her exactly where he was. This response was troubling on several levels. Interstate 5, even in the mountain passes, is well lit with adequate signage for navigation, especially for someone familiar with the route. The idea that Bryce couldn't determine his location suggested either that he had left the main highway for some reason, or that his perception and judgment were somehow impaired in ways that made normal navigation difficult. At 2:08 a.m. on August 30th, 2013, Bryce made what would be his final phone call to his mother. The conversation was brief, but would later be analyzed countless times by family members, investigators, and anyone trying to understand what happened in those crucial hours. Bryce told Karen that he was too tired to continue driving and planned to pull over to get some sleep before completing the journey home. This decision seemed reasonable on the surface. Drowsy driving is dangerous, and pulling over to rest is exactly what responsible drivers are advised to do when fatigue sets in. Karen, despite her concerns about the delays and unusual behavior, agreed that getting some rest was the right thing to do. She told her son that she would see him in the morning, expecting that a few hours of sleep would refresh him enough to complete the final leg of his journey. But those would be the last words Karen Laspisa would ever hear from her son. At 2:08 a.m. on August 30th, 2013, Bryce Laspisa ended that phone call and disappeared into the darkness of the Southern California mountains, leaving behind a mystery that continues to confound investigators more than a decade later. What happened in the hours between that final phone call and dawn remains one of the most puzzling aspects of Bryce's case. Security camera footage from the area would later show his Toyota Highlander pulling off the highway onto an access road at approximately 2:15 a.m., just minutes after ending the conversation with his mother. This timing suggested that Bryce had indeed followed through on his stated intention to pull over and rest. However, the location where he stopped was not a typical rest area or safe pullout where tired drivers normally park to sleep. Instead, the access road led toward Castaic Lake Recreation Area, a sprawling complex of camping areas, boat launches, and recreational facilities nestled in the mountains. During the early morning hours, this area would have been largely deserted, with most campers and recreationalists settled in for the night. Castaic Lake itself is a reservoir created by the construction of Castaic Dam, forming a large body of water that serves both as a source of water storage and a popular recreational destination. The lake is surrounded by rugged terrain, with steep hillsides, rocky outcroppings, and dense brush, creating a landscape that can be both beautiful and treacherous, especially in the dark. The recreation area includes several different sections, each designed for specific activities. There are campgrounds for overnight visitors, day-use areas for picnicking and swimming, boat ramps for water sports enthusiasts, and hiking trails that wind through the surrounding hills. During daylight hours, the area buzzes with activity, but in the pre-dawn darkness of August 30th, it would have been virtually empty except for the occasional early-rising angler or camper. Security cameras in the recreation area captured what would become crucial evidence in understanding Bryce's final hours. The footage showed his Toyota Highlander entering the area and driving through various sections of the complex. Most mysteriously, the cameras captured his vehicle making multiple passes through certain areas, as if he was searching for something specific, or perhaps building up courage for some predetermined action. This behavior, driving repeatedly through the same areas, suggested a level of indecision or internal struggle that would later fuel speculation about Bryce's mental state and intentions. Was he looking for the perfect place to park and sleep, as he had told his mother? Was he struggling with some kind of emotional crisis that made decision-making difficult? Or was there something more sinister at work, either from within his own mind or from external forces? The surveillance footage provided a timeline of Bryce's movements, but offered little insight into his motivations or mental state. The cameras showed his vehicle, but couldn't capture the internal struggle that may have been taking place inside the SUV, as a young man grappled with whatever demons had been pursuing him since those first concerning days back at college. As dawn approached on August 30th, the peaceful quiet of Castaic Lake was about to be shattered by a discovery that would launch one of California's most enduring missing person cases. At approximately 5:30 a.m., as the first light of day began to illuminate the rugged terrain around the lake, a California Highway Patrol officer spotted something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. At the bottom of a steep 25-foot embankment, lying on its side among the rocks and brush, was a severely damaged Toyota Highlander SUV. The vehicle had clearly been involved in a significant accident, having left the roadway and tumbled down the rocky slope before coming to rest in a precarious position. The rear window had been kicked out from the inside, creating a jagged opening that spoke to someone's desperate attempt to escape from the damaged vehicle. When officers made their way down to the crash site, they found a scene that was both explicable and deeply mysterious. The SUV was clearly Bryce's, confirmed by the license plate and registration information inside. His personal belongings were scattered around the vehicle and the surrounding area. His duffel bag, laptop computer, wallet, and cell phone, all the items that would be expected in the car of a college student traveling home to visit his parents. But Bryce himself was nowhere to be found. Despite the severity of the crash and the isolated location, there was no sign of the vehicle's driver, no blood trail leading away from the scene, no clothing caught on the brush, no footprints in the soft earth that might indicate which direction he had gone. It was as if Bryce Laspisa had simply vanished into the morning air, leaving behind only the twisted wreckage of his vehicle and a collection of personal belongings that would provide few clues about what had happened. The crash scene itself told a troubling story. Investigators determined that the SUV had been traveling at a considerable speed when it left the roadway, suggesting that this was not a case of a drowsy driver slowly drifting off the pavement. The angle of approach and the distance the vehicle had traveled through the air before hitting the embankment indicated intentional acceleration toward the cliff edge. Even more disturbing was the realization that from the roadway where the SUV had left the pavement, the waters of Castaic Lake would have appeared much closer than they actually were, especially in the pre-dawn darkness. The perspective created by the terrain and the elevation changes could easily have fooled someone into thinking that a vehicle leaving the roadway at high speed would land directly in the lake rather than on the rocky embankment below. This observation led investigators to consider the possibility that Bryce had intentionally driven his vehicle over the cliff, perhaps in a suicide attempt that he believed would send him into the lake waters. The repeated passes through the recreation area, captured on security cameras, could be interpreted as someone working up the courage for such a desperate act, repeatedly approaching and backing away from a final, irreversible decision. However, this theory raised as many questions as it answered. If Bryce had intended to harm himself, why had he kicked out the rear window to escape from the vehicle after the crash? The broken glass and the way it was scattered suggested that he had deliberately created an exit route and used it to leave the SUV after it came to rest. This behavior seemed inconsistent with someone who had just attempted suicide and should have been either dead or severely injured. The discovery of the crashed vehicle triggered an immediate and massive response from multiple law enforcement agencies. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, California Highway Patrol, and local search and rescue teams converged on Castaic Lake to begin looking for the missing young man. The challenging terrain, combined with the size of the search area, made this a complex operation requiring specialized equipment and expertise. Search and rescue dogs were brought in to try to track Bryce's scent from the crash site. The dogs, trained to follow human scent trails even in difficult terrain, picked up Bryce's scent near the wrecked SUV and began following what appeared to be a clear trail. The trail led away from the crash site, up the embankment, and across the dam that forms Castaic Lake. The fact that the dogs were able to track a scent trail was both encouraging and puzzling. It suggested that Bryce had indeed survived the crash and had been able to walk away from the scene under his own power. However, it also raised questions about why he would leave the area rather than seeking help, especially if he had been injured in the accident. The scent trail continued across the dam structure, a concrete barrier that holds back the waters of the lake. This is a substantial piece of infrastructure, and walking across it would have required considerable physical effort, especially for someone who might have been injured or disoriented from a vehicle crash. The fact that Bryce apparently made this crossing suggested that he was both physically capable of sustained movement and had some specific destination in mind. On the other side of the dam, the scent trail continued toward a truck stop that serves travelers on Interstate 5. This facility, typical of highway truck stops, includes fuel pumps, a convenience store, restaurant facilities, and parking areas where long-haul truckers rest between driving shifts. During the early morning hours of August 30th, it would have been one of the few places in the area with people present and lights on. The trail ended at the truck stop, providing investigators with both a clear endpoint and a frustrating dead end. The dogs could track Bryce's scent to this location, but could go no further, suggesting that he had either gotten into a vehicle or had somehow managed to eliminate his scent trail from that point forward. This development opened up new possibilities, but also created new mysteries about what had happened to the missing young man. The implications of the scent trail ending at the truck stop were significant. If Bryce had made his way there on foot after the crash, he would have encountered truck drivers, convenience store employees, or other travelers who might have seen him or interacted with him. However, despite extensive interviews with anyone who had been in the area during those crucial hours, investigators found no witnesses who remembered seeing anyone matching Bryce's description. This absence of witnesses was particularly puzzling, given Bryce's distinctive appearance. At 5 feet 11 inches with red hair and blue eyes, he was the kind of person who would have been noticed, especially if he had been disheveled or injured from a vehicle crash. The fact that no one at the truck stop remembered seeing him suggested either that he had been extremely careful to avoid detection or that something else had happened to prevent witnesses from encountering him. The possibility that Bryce had gotten into another vehicle at the truck stop opened up numerous scenarios, both voluntary and involuntary. He might have accepted a ride from a Good Samaritan trucker who was unaware of the search for him. He could have been picked up by someone he had contacted by phone, though investigators found no evidence of such communications. More troubling possibilities included abduction by someone with criminal intent or involvement in illegal activities that required leaving the area quickly. Dive teams were deployed to search the waters of Castaic Lake, working on the theory that despite the crashed vehicle being found on the embankment, Bryce might have made his way to the water and drowned, either accidentally or intentionally. The lake's considerable size and depth made this a challenging operation, requiring specialized equipment and techniques to cover the areas where a body might reasonably be expected to be found. The divers searched methodically, focusing first on areas closest to the crash site and then expanding their search to include deeper sections of the lake where currents might have carried a body. They used sonar equipment to detect any underwater anomalies that might indicate the presence of human remains, and they coordinated with surface teams to ensure comprehensive coverage of the lake's extensive shoreline. Despite the thorough and professional nature of the search, no trace of Bryce was found in the lake waters. This negative result was both disappointing and significant, effectively ruling out some of the most obvious explanations for his disappearance while leaving investigators to consider more complex scenarios. The search operation expanded to include the rugged terrain surrounding Castaic Lake, a challenging landscape of steep hillsides, dense brush, and rocky outcroppings that could easily conceal a person, whether alive or dead. Search teams combed through areas where someone leaving the crash site might have gone, looking for any sign that Bryce had been in the vicinity. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the search area, looking for heat signatures that might indicate a person in distress. Ground teams with search dogs covered areas that were inaccessible to aircraft, carefully examining ravines, caves, and thick vegetation where someone might have sought shelter or where remains might be hidden. The challenging terrain made this search extremely difficult and time-consuming. The area around Castaic Lake includes numerous hiding places where someone could remain concealed, either voluntarily or because they were unable to move due to injury. Additionally, the region is home to various wildlife, including predators that might have disturbed or moved any remains, further complicating the search effort. As days passed without any sign of Bryce, the search effort began to evolve from a rescue operation to a recovery mission, though hope was never entirely abandoned. Volunteers joined the search, including family members, friends, and concerned members of the public who wanted to help in any way possible. The community response was overwhelming, with people donating time, resources, and expertise to support the effort to find the missing young man. Karen and Michael Laspisa found themselves at the center of a media storm as news of their son's disappearance spread. They worked tirelessly to keep Bryce's case in the public eye, participating in interviews, distributing flyers, and coordinating with investigators to ensure that every possible lead was pursued. Their pain was evident in every public appearance, but so was their determination to find their son and bring him home. The media attention brought both benefits and challenges to the search effort. On the positive side, widespread coverage meant that Bryce's photograph and description were seen by millions of people across California and beyond, increasing the chances that someone who had encountered him would come forward with information. Television news broadcasts, newspaper articles, and social media posts helped maintain public awareness of the case, even as other news stories competed for attention. However, media attention also brought challenges, including false sightings, conspiracy theories, and well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful tips that consumed investigative resources without advancing the case. Every potential sighting had to be checked out, every tip investigated, every theory considered, even when experience suggested that most would lead nowhere. 5 days after the discovery of Bryce's crashed SUV, the search effort received a jolt when a body was found burning in the area near Castaic Lake. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team and devastated Bryce's family, who feared that their worst nightmares were about to be confirmed. The location of the body, relatively close to where Bryce had disappeared, seemed to suggest a connection to his case. However, investigators soon determined that the burned remains belonged to someone entirely different, a victim of an unrelated homicide from Los Angeles. While this news brought relief to the Laspisa family in one sense, it also meant that they were no closer to finding their son or understanding what had happened to him. The coincidence of finding another victim so close to Bryce's disappearance site was disturbing, but ultimately irrelevant to their case. As the immediate search and rescue phase of the operation wound down without success, investigators began to shift their focus to other aspects of the case. They conducted extensive interviews with Bryce's friends, roommates, and acquaintances at Sierra College, trying to understand the behavioral changes that had preceded his disappearance and whether anyone had insights into what might have been troubling him. These interviews painted a picture of a young man who'd been struggling with issues that he had not shared openly with those around him. Friends confirmed the reports of increased drinking and experimentation with recreational drugs, behaviors that were inconsistent with the responsible person they had known during his first year of college. Some mentioned that Bryce had seemed stressed or anxious in the days before his disappearance, though none could point to specific events or circumstances that might have triggered such feelings. The roommates' accounts were particularly valuable in understanding Bryce's final days at college. He described how Bryce had been giving away personal possessions, a behavior that in hindsight seemed to suggest that he was preparing for something significant. The Xbox and diamond earrings that Bryce had distributed to others were recovered and examined for any clues they might provide, but they offered no insights into his state of mind or intentions. Cell phone records were analyzed extensively, providing investigators with a detailed timeline of Bryce's communications in the days and weeks leading up to his disappearance. These records showed normal patterns of communication with family and friends up until the final few days, when the frequency and nature of his calls began to change. The final series of calls to his mother provided crucial information about his location and state of mind during those last hours, but they also raised questions about what he might have been experiencing that caused such unusual behavior. The analysis of financial records showed that Bryce had not made any unusual purchases or transactions that might indicate planning for an extended disappearance. His bank accounts showed normal college student spending patterns, with no large cash withdrawals or suspicious activity that might suggest preparation for life in hiding. This evidence argued against theories that Bryce had planned his disappearance in advance, though it didn't rule out the possibility that his decision to vanish had been made impulsively. Computer forensics experts examined Bryce's laptop and any other electronic devices he had been using, looking for clues about his online activities, communications, and mental state. They searched for evidence of research into methods of disappearing, communications with people who might have assisted him, or any other digital footprints that might explain what had happened. However, these examinations revealed nothing obviously relevant to his disappearance. As months passed without breakthrough developments, investigators began to consider the possibility that Bryce's disappearance had been voluntary. This theory suggested that whatever had been troubling him in those final days at college had led him to make a conscious decision to abandon his previous life and start over somewhere else. The behavioral changes, the giving away of possessions, and the strange delays during his journey home could all be interpreted as signs of someone preparing to disappear. However, the voluntary disappearance theory faced significant challenges. Bryce had no obvious motive to abandon a life that appeared from the outside to be going well. He had supportive parents, was succeeding academically, and had no known legal troubles or other issues that might make disappearing seem attractive. Additionally, the dramatic crash of his vehicle seemed inconsistent with someone planning to disappear quietly, as it guaranteed that his absence would be discovered quickly and investigated thoroughly. The involuntary disappearance theories were equally problematic, but couldn't be dismissed entirely. The possibility that Bryce had been abducted from the truck stop remained viable, though there was no evidence of any criminal activity or anyone with motive to harm him. Random abduction by strangers is statistically rare, and the circumstances of his disappearance made such theories difficult to support with evidence. More complex theories began to emerge as investigators and amateur researchers tried to make sense of the available evidence. Some suggested that Bryce might have been suffering from a mental health crisis that caused disorientation and poor decision-making, but wasn't severe enough to be obvious to casual observers. Under this theory, his strange behavior during the journey home and his decision to drive off the cliff could be explained as the actions of someone who was not thinking clearly due to psychological distress. The head injury theory gained some support from those who noted that Bryce had apparently survived the vehicle crash and been able to walk away from the scene. It was possible that he had sustained a head injury that affected his memory and judgment, but didn't prevent him from physical movement. Such an injury might explain why he had wandered away from the crash site instead of seeking help, and why he hadn't been in contact with his family since the accident. However, Medical experts pointed out that head injuries severe enough to cause significant memory loss and disorientation would likely have other symptoms that would make it difficult for someone to walk several miles across challenging terrain. Additionally, if Bryce had been suffering from such an injury, it seemed likely that someone at the truck stop or elsewhere would have noticed his condition and offered assistance. Family members continued their own investigation efforts, working with private investigators, maintaining social media presence, and following up on tips and potential sightings that came in from the public. Karen and Michael Laspisa refused to give up hope that their son was still alive somewhere, and they pursued every possible lead with the dedication that only parents can bring to such a search. The find, Bryce Laspisa social media pages became gathering points for people interested in the case, sharing information, theories, and potential sightings. While most of the tips and sightings ultimately led nowhere, the family maintained that it only took one genuine sighting to break the case open and bring their son home. Anniversary searches became annual events, with volunteers returning to the Castaic Lake area and surrounding regions to conduct renewed searches with fresh eyes and sometimes new technology. These efforts served both practical and emotional purposes, keeping hope alive while also ensuring that areas that might have been missed during the initial search received additional attention. As years passed, age progression photographs were created and distributed, showing what Bryce might look like as he aged. These images, created by forensic artists using computer modeling, attempted to account for normal aging processes and were distributed widely in hopes that someone might recognize an older version of the missing young man. The case attracted attention from true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators who analyzed every detail of the available evidence and proposed new theories about what might have happened. While most of these efforts were well-intentioned and some provided valuable insights, they also generated numerous false leads and unsubstantiated theories that sometimes complicated the official investigation. Psychics and other alternative investigators also became involved in the case, offering their services to the desperate family. While law enforcement generally doesn't rely on such methods, the Laspisas were willing to consider any approach that might help find their son. Most of these efforts proved fruitless, but they demonstrated the lengths to which the family was willing to go in their search for answers. Technology improvements over the years provided new opportunities to re-examine evidence and search areas that might have been missed initially. Better satellite imagery, improved search techniques, and new forensic methods all offered hope that fresh approaches might yield new clues about Bryce's fate. The legal status of the case remained that of a missing person investigation, with Bryce officially classified as voluntarily missing despite his family's belief that something more sinister had occurred. This classification affected how resources were allocated to the case and what investigative methods could be used, sometimes frustrating family members who felt that not every avenue was being pursued aggressively enough. Support groups for families of missing persons provided some comfort to Michael and Karen Laspisa, connecting them with others who understood the unique pain of not knowing what happened to a loved one. These relationships offered emotional support and sometimes practical advice about maintaining investigations and dealing with the media and law enforcement. The financial costs of maintaining a long-term search effort placed additional stress on the family as private investigators, reward money, and search expenses accumulated over the years. Fundraising efforts helped offset some of these costs, but the financial burden of searching for a missing person indefinitely was substantial. Jurisdictional issues sometimes complicated the investigation, as Bryce's disappearance involved multiple counties and agencies, each with their own procedures and priorities. Coordination between agencies was generally good, But the complexity of multi-jurisdictional cases inevitably created some challenges and delays. Today, more than a decade after Bryce Laspisa vanished into the darkness near Castaic Lake, his case remains one of California's most perplexing missing person mysteries. The evidence collected during the initial investigation remains inconclusive, capable of supporting multiple theories, but definitively proving none. His crashed SUV, the scent trail to the truck stop, and the complete absence of witnesses continue to confound investigators and amateur researchers alike. The physical evidence from the crash scene has been preserved and re-examined multiple times, but it tells the same ambiguous story. Bryce survived the crash, kicked out the rear window, and walked away from the scene. Where he went and why remains unknown, despite extensive investigation and countless hours of analysis. New tips and potential sightings continue to come in regularly, though most prove to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. Each tip is evaluated and investigated when resources permit, maintaining the hope that eventually someone with genuine information will come forward. The impact on his family cannot be overstated. Michael and Karen Laspisa have dedicated their lives to finding their son, maintaining hope and determination, even as the years pass without answers. Their strength in the face of such uncertainty has inspired others and demonstrated the enduring power of parental love. The case has also had broader impacts, highlighting the challenges faced by families of missing persons and the limitations of law enforcement resources when dealing with cases that don't fall into clear categories. Bryce's disappearance has contributed to discussions about how such cases are investigated and how families can best advocate for their missing loved ones. Changes in technology and investigative techniques over the past decade provide some hope that new approaches might eventually yield breakthrough discoveries. DNA analysis, computer modeling, and digital forensics continue to evolve, offering new possibilities for examining old evidence or discovering new clues. The enduring mystery of what happened to Bryce Laspisa continues to captivate public attention and generate new theories and investigations. True crime podcasts, television documentaries, and online discussions keep his case in the public eye, maintaining awareness that could eventually lead to the discovery of new information. For Michael and Karen Laspisa, every day brings the possibility that they might finally learn what happened to their son. They continue to believe that he is alive somewhere, perhaps unable to return home due to injury, memory loss, or other circumstances beyond his control. They maintain that they will never give up searching for him and will continue to pursue every lead and opportunity that might bring him home. The case serves as a reminder of how quickly life can change and how even the most ordinary activities, like driving home to visit family, can lead to extraordinary mysteries. Bryce Laspisa's disappearance demonstrates that in our modern world, with all its technology and connectivity, it is still possible for someone to vanish completely, leaving behind only questions and the enduring love of those who refuse to stop looking for answers. The story of Bryce Laspisa is far from over. Somewhere, whether in memory, in hidden locations, or in the hearts of those who continue to search for him, pieces of the puzzle wait to be discovered. Until that day comes, his case remains a testament to the mysteries that can unfold in the shadows of our everyday world, and to the unwavering determination of those who love him to never stop seeking the truth.